Hello, I'm Nick Teberger. I'm the program manager for the Social and Cultural Informatics platform, and today, together with the SCIP team, we'll be presenting on issues around becoming a digital researcher in 2020. I want to begin by paying my respect to the original owner of the land I work on, which are the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. We'll be recording this webinar and posting it to our YouTube channel, and we'll have a question and answer session afterwards, so please post your questions in the chat, and also feel free to suggest topics for future webinars. We're going to add your emails to our email listserv. You're able to unsubscribe yourself if you don't want that to happen. And they're the two websites for SCIP.
And in this section, I just want to talk briefly about some of the key aspects of the digital humanities and computational social sciences and the methodologies that are associated with them, and some of the myths and realities and key questions that need to be answered before you embark on a journey doing research using these methods. But first, digital humanities and computational social science are about large data sets, online, born digital, or otherwise digitized. And they're about innovative and computationally intensive methods for analysis. Many of you have heard the term web scraping, for instance, or various types of text analysis of social media data, predictive modeling, social network analysis, simulations, and agent-based modeling. All of these types of analysis rely on digital humanities or computational social science methods. I've outlined a couple of myths and realities and a key question that keeps coming up in this area of research. And these are based on my experiences in the field as a graduate researcher, instructor, and now a data scientist over the last roughly 10 years or so. The first myth is that you must have a background in programming, computer science, or IT. While that's true for some people in this field, the reality is that the vast majority are social scientists and humanists, and the vast majority of those tools do not require any programming knowledge or previous experience. You can see my colleague Amanda Belton's presentation in a little bit, in which she goes into detail about one of those tools and talks about this point in more detail. Another myth that keeps coming up is that digital humanities tools require a lot of time and effort to learn. Again, while that's true for some of these tools, in general, they require about the same amount of time as learning any other methodology. So if you are a qualitative researcher, for instance, you can think about all of the courses that you've taken on interviewing techniques and field work, and all of the time and effort you've put into your research. By comparison, the digital humanities methods, for the most part, require very little time to learn and apply. And one common question that comes up pretty frequently goes something like this. Well, I'm only interested in collecting and analyzing data from social media for one or two projects at most. Why do I have to learn all these other tools and spend so much time learning them? That's a very good question. It's a legitimate question. But the answer is something like the following. Well, digital humanities is really a lifelong research agenda. It includes a complex set of ethical and methodological choices that only you as a researcher can make. These choices need to be made with a lot of care and knowledge about the methods that you're using and the story that you want to tell based on your research questions. So imagine a quantitative researcher who wants to perform interviews or do ethnographic work for the very first time with little or no background in qualitative methods or participant observation. Obviously, that would be a problem. If you were giving advice to this person, you would say, well, you need to take some classes in interviewing techniques, you need to take some classes in qualitative methods to get a better understanding of how they work out in the field. Digital humanities are the same way. They require some time to learn and understand the methods before you're able to apply them. So the most common problem in the field today, in my opinion, is using methodology that the researcher is not very familiar with. I'm not suggesting that you go out there and become an expert in digital humanities. What I am suggesting is whatever tool or type of method you choose to use, try to get a basic understanding of how it works, and don't rely purely on your co-authors or other collaborators to be experts and explain how everything works. So you need to have a base understanding of how these methods work before you apply them. And that's really just common sense and kind of a key thing. So why should you learn the digital humanities methods? Well, most of the tools associated with this methodology and analysis specifically are free and well maintained. And what that means is that basically you don't ever have to worry about paying for a license, and you can collaborate across the board with multiple researchers at the same time. And that's really kind of the power of some of the software that I'll mention in a second. These types of tools tend to be customizable and fun, especially when it comes to things like data visualization. And they really provide an all-in-one approach in most cases. And by that I mean you can import and clean your data set, visualize it, analyze it, and even publish it as a website or as a PDF document via Markdown, all in one program. And that's really kind of the power of some of these tools. Specifically, tools like R and Python, or more specifically, statistical programming languages like R and Python, have a huge academic community supporting them. So there's a lot of materials out there for training purposes, and you can find a lot of videos on YouTube. So they really have a tight-knit academic community that constantly produces new libraries and packages and ways of doing research. And again, both are essentially free software or open source. And all of these things provide for full control over the research process. And that's really another one of the key things, is that instead of having to rely on multiple tools, if you can find one or two tools that do everything you need for your research, then that is a much better way to go about doing your research than relying on multiple different tools that may have different requirements to work and operate. And finally, a point needs to be made about developing your digital humanities or computational social science skills. And this is true of any type of digital or computational research outside of the humanities and the social sciences, but since we're in the Faculty of Arts, those are the two schools that we are mostly dealing with. But again, this idea that these fields and these methods are really a lifelong research agenda. And advanced graduate students and early career researchers, in my opinion, are best positioned to master these key skills because they tend to have a little more time on their hands than more established assistant, associate, or full professors who might have more of a teaching load, who might have a bigger research agenda and have more things to do where they can't dedicate as much time to picking up some of these key skills. But if you're an advanced graduate student and if you're an early career researcher interested in doing digital methods, the best thing you can do for yourself is to pick up as many different skills in this methodology as you possibly can going forward. This is especially important because it also applies to future employment opportunities for advanced graduate students and early career researchers, but for everyone. it's especially important to learn the language of the digital humanities. And what I mean by that is when it comes to grant applications, if you're using a data set that's born digital, or if you're using some kind of methodology that lends itself nicely to computational analysis, you really need to speak the language of that methodology in your application, because a lot of the time what happens is that the people who make the decisions are kind of key people in these areas. They know what to look for. They know what kind of language you're using and what that implies. So they can tell just by the language you're using how much you actually know about the methodology that you're employing. And they make their decisions based on that. So I would suggest, again, going back to the previous point, of learning as much as you can about the methodology that you're using, even if you're someone who is just kind of dabbling in this stuff. Maybe this isn't your primary area of focus, and that's fine, but try to pick up as much as you can in terms of the theory and methods of the type of research that you're doing, so that way you can be seen as someone who, even though this is not their primary area of focus, still knows all of the things that they need to know about the research, or at least the basics. And finally, in the post-COVID world of research, and with the abundance of free online materials that are available for people who want to pick up these skills, these all mean a low barrier of entry for those who are interested in taking on this journey. Again, the key point must be that this is a lifelong research agenda. So whether you choose to dabble in it now, a couple of papers here and there, or maybe a broader research agenda, these skills will stay with you, and you will only add to them as you move forward. So the advice here is try to pick up as much as you can, and try to really kind of learn the basics of what you're doing and move on from there. So now I will turn it over to my colleague, Greg, who will be talking to you in more depth about some of the tools and some of the skills that you can focus on from the very beginning, some of the things that most digital humanists wish they knew when they first started on this journey. Thank you.
So look, there's no doubt that these new digital technologies open up opportunities that were probably unimaginable not that long ago. I suppose what I'm kind of suggesting is that the technology has always played a key part in research workflows and knowledge creation. Sorry, workflows and knowledge creation. So it's a fallacy to suggest that suddenly you need an IT background to be able to use these new tools and methods. So technology has always played a key part, I think, in processing raw data, moving towards a coherent research question, and then getting insights out of that. The ability to sort of, I suppose, some of the key things to consider is, the ability to harvest and assemble reuse data for research purposes, to engage, analyse, synthesise evidence from a number of resources, to design research projects and plan data storage, retrieval, that kind of thing. These are all key things in academic research. And I suppose as the tools have sort of accelerated, those fundamentals sort of remain. So what are the key skills and that you might need to be able to accommodate working with new tools and technologies into the future? This was a key question from a report that I think is still, or project still being carried out by the Australian Academy of Humanities. And that's looking at the notion of what, researchers, what competencies, what skills are researchers going to need to be able to analyse, to work with online collections. I think Trent mentioned the ethical considerations with sharing, using data and that kind of thing. And all these are key components of the future humanities skill set. So, again, digital tools that transform, combine, summarize, interpret structured data are pretty central now to the process of knowledge creation. So as opposed to thinking, again, back to that premise that you need an IT background to engage with this, it's probably more about, I suppose, looking at where we are at this moment in time and looking ahead to realise that probably what we need is a common digital literacy framework that I suppose is underpinned by training and infrastructure that's going to equip researchers to be able to work with the new tools and the challenges into the future. So that's the end of my soapbox. Now I'll get on to a couple of more practical kind of things. And I thought we'd start by just some observations about what we've seen over the last 6 months within Skip. For people who aren't aware of what we do a lot of digital methods and data support, primarily within the Faculty of Arts and MGSE. So obviously the impact of COVID has had a huge influence on the way we work, the way we're living at the moment. And that has also had an impact on, I suppose, the types of requests we're getting through Skip as researchers have to accommodate these new changing environment. So I suppose one of the things I considered putting these slides together was just the prevalence and impact of data on our lives now. That data and numbers. I mean, every day there's news conferences, press releases on numbers. How many cases have been identified today? We're inundated with graphs, just showing spikes, showing the increase, and that kind of thing. So I suppose these are the influences that are swirling around us. One of the things that I've noticed is that many researchers who might traditionally look to be going out to do field work, obviously with social distancing and especially for us in Victoria being locked down, we can't do that at the moment. So they're looking for new ways to, I suppose, approach their research. And one of those might be looking for different sources of data through social media, and in doing so, kind of accommodating some digital methods they may not have used before. Likewise too, that inability to go out and attend conferences has a huge impact. So a lot of researchers are also coming to us looking at, how can they communicate their findings. There's a lot of interest in web portals, web platforms, ways researchers can efficiently and effectively reach their audiences. And I suppose that last point, which is a little bit cut out for me, is just this general interest at the moment, realising that we're all pretty much confined to our houses. Not to dismiss the demands on people's time with family and the stresses that go with that, but there does seem to be a noticeable increase in people's interest and willingness to want to start exploring some different digital skills and methods. Which leads me to digital skills and methods. So what I thought I would do in this last part of the presentation is give my folksy kind of bits of advice in terms of people that are wanting to kind of progress with using a particular digital tool or approach, or if you're starting from scratch. And quite often, because we do a lot of consultations, we tend to pick up a few things, and that's people's reservation. I suppose their sense that it's, again, I don't have an IT background, it's going to be too complicated. But I think for me, the point is everyone kind of has to start somewhere. The best way to approach it really is that nobody knows everything. You need ideally to pick a particular area or something that is most appealing or interest to you. A good way to go about that is to look at researchers working in already established and working in the field that you're interested in, just to see what methods, techniques, tools they're using. Virtual social networks I find really helpful, and that's a very convoluted way to, or code for Twitter. Basically, I use quite a lot. There's some very active communities online, and a lot of them are very open in terms of sharing their information and advice. I'd also suggest there's a mountain of online tutorials that you can do to, I suppose, start testing some of these tools and technologies. Do some training. Research Computing Services at the university offers, I suppose, introductory courses to different programming applications and techniques. At Skip, we also do a bit of training ourselves and webinars such as this, but we try to make it a little bit more discipline-based and, I suppose, problem-based. So if we do some training, our assumption is that we want to sort of ground it in, I suppose, a research question or problem, and sort of go through that as a demonstrator, or go through that process, rather than assuming that people are going to come and, from the get-go want to learn the foundations of what is Python and that kind of thing. There's other places and people better equipped to do that than us. So yeah, and in terms of starting somewhere, come and talk to us. That's pretty much what we do. Whether it's training that we deliver ourselves or general advice, we can kind of point you into the direction and save you a bit of time. One of the other things I want to talk about in this regard, and I realised putting these slides together, for me, this was a bit of a lessons learnt exercise. A lot of this was things I know now that I wish I might have known 10 years ago. So when you're starting to engage with digital tools and that, you tend to come up, again, there's this often what gets introduced as a bit of a dichotomy in that you can either use a tool or you can either use a script or a programming language. You can basically use both, would be my advice. So tools are great if you've got a specific task to do. And we use tools every day, whether it's email, Excel, that kind of thing. I think Trent might have hit on this too, that quite often we give one bit of advice we give people is that if you've got one specific job to do, so learning a new tool or programming language, is it intrinsic to your research? Or basically you do have the desire to move forward with that, that's when you probably need to reach out to get some help, or use a tool. You basically, like any tool, you pick it up, you use it, you put it down and move on. There's no need to, we don't advise people to spend 6 months of their life learning how to code just in order to realise that it doesn't have any value for them. One of the downsides, though, of certain tools is that it can lead to a dependency on third parties, which basically means, a lot of commercial entities offer different tools. Now, if something happens to that company, one example I'd provide would be Facebook. It wasn't that long ago, in the wake of Cambridge Analytica, that prior to that, Facebook was providing access, so you could use a computational method to be able to extract data out of the Facebook platform. In the wake of Cambridge Analytica, and also too at the time when a lot of those social media platforms, really recognise the monetary value in the data they collect from people, they restricted access. So suddenly all those tools and methods that had been created by researchers were almost overnight became redundant. So when you're using a tool or developing a method that's based on, I suppose, a third party beyond your control, you are a little bit at their bequest. The other point being is that quite often with some of these tools, it can be quite difficult to replicate your data or process, replicate your process or analysis, especially if you find you get new data. So you need to go through that process again, or there are some changes to your variables within your existing data set. It can be quite hard to sort of come back 6 months down the track and remember the process that you followed. So this leads us to scripts. Now, scripts work a little bit differently. So learning to write your own scripts has the advantage in that they're transparent, reproducible research practices. So certain tools like Jupyter Notebooks, which I know are very popular with a lot of people in digital humanities, or R Markdown, which I use to create these slides, lets you sort of, I suppose, combine in the one file your commentary, live code, and the results from that code. So you can run a block of code and it will produce graphs, it will show you data tables, all that kind of thing. So the advantage there is that commenting your work as you go, you can share that with colleagues or come back 6 months later, still have a record of exactly how you conducted that. As I mentioned, this part for me was kind of considering, what advice would I provide to people who are wanting to progress their skills in using digital tools. I suppose one of the caveats is, be prepared for dead ends and lots of them. I suppose it's the process of learning, really. That you will hit, even I find myself today that I'll have progress, and then all of a sudden you hit a wall and that's it. And the best thing I found is just to close the laptop and come back tomorrow. So there are lots of dead ends, but don't let those deter you. I was just looking at the typo there in project management. So I had this point as a project management task. I like to approach things like this nowadays. I find that it works for me. If I want to use or learn to use a new package or tool, I'll try to take a project management mindset to it. So it's pretty easy to sort of get distracted. We've all got distractions in our lives with other responsibilities. But a lot of these tools, it's quite easy to sort of drop what you're doing and look at the next shiny thing over there. So what I try to do is actually write a little note to myself to say, I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to spend 2 weeks. That's all I'm going to do. Also being mindful if there's any sort of dependencies or other things I need to focus on that one new method or particular thing I want to play with. More caveats. One of the things too, especially when you're learning to code, is that there's lots of examples and tutorials online. It's actually people share their code, so you can download their code, their notebook or whatever and run it. And it's alarmingly easy to do. Now that's a pro and a con. The pro is that it's really helpful and useful in terms of your own learning, and also it's immensely satisfying, especially when you're starting out, just to be able to run some code and see a result. That you can give yourself a little pat on the back. One of the cons, however, I've found is as you start to go further into it, is that quite often a lot of the code that's posted online has been up there for a couple of years. So for a lot of programming languages, some of the programming, the underpinning programming libraries have moved on basically and are out of date. So it's not uncommon to get some code that you'll take and you'll think, Bonza, this looks great. You'll run it and it doesn't work. And the immediate reaction is, what did I do wrong? And the fact is you haven't done anything wrong. It's just that the code is essentially broken. And no one actually, it's no one's job to go back and clean up the internet. All of these people doing these tutorials have tended to move on. So I found that was, for me, an important realization that, that you can get immense frustration from taking something which someone claims to work. And the Facebook API example is a good example of that. There's lots of tutorials and articles, journal articles and that, talking about how to use that, but the fact is that time has passed and they don't work anymore. And the same thing too, I might also suggest for textbooks. When you look at textbooks around digital research methods, things move on pretty quickly. So even if those books are 2 or 3 years old, chances are there might be a newer package that comes out that handles that kind of thing a lot more efficiently. All right, so I'm just about done. They're my little words of encouragement. As I said, as I was putting this together, I was kind of contemplating how do you give people a bit of confidence to back themselves to go down this path? What does success look like? And as soon as you start researching or Googling for, success memes, you start to get these kind of things where you're on top of the mountain and, everything's great. But I think most people would recognise, and I think in some ways too, this is typical of research, that success isn't a straight line. Success might mean that rather than getting straight to the pinnacle, you've had to go down the goat track, you've fallen down the cliff, you've got up, you've kept walking again, you've got lost, and then somehow you make your way to where you need to go. So a little bit of the we're all in this together moment. Everyone's learning. I think it's just back yourself, keep going. We're all on a learning path. There's always new things to learn. It's a bit of a journey, I think, and commitment, as Trent was alluding to. And that's it for me. So thank you for listening. I think I'm handing back to Nick.
Nick, the audio isn't coming through.
Apologies, the audio is not coming through. I'll just try to. How's that?
Yeah, just need to turn it up, please.
I'm here to talk about digital humanities, and perhaps a good way to talk about digital humanities
a little more,
is to first talk about print.
or all the way up, if you
So
can.
printed journal articles and humanities scholarship have a shared history. They've shaped each other's form. Research in print is rigorous, structured, and long. Digital humanities brings the need to craft the short form. And this opens opportunities to use excerpts of your research to invite your audience into the longer form of articles, books, and dissertations. We need your research out there, accessible by a diverse range of people, and digital humanities gives you the opportunity to reach your audience in ways that can make it easier for them to learn from you. One way to look at research in a digital world is the difference between distant reading, large-scale patterns across a massive text artifacts, with close reading of the meaning encoded in a single textual artifact. We can take a computational approach and read thousands or even millions of blog entries or journal articles or tweets, and this distant reading can reveal patterns that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. We can then dive into one or a few of these texts to better understand the patterns we are seeing, or the patterns we see help us identify the one or few texts that matter to our research question. A bit of history about a computational approach. Ada Lovelace is the godmother of programming, an algorithmic abstraction of computational approaches. And she wrote of the beauty of the computer she called the analytical engine. As a data scientist, I work mostly with data visualizations, and there is a parallel to how we read visualizations. On a macro level, our visual system can process some things pre-attentively. So on this weather forecast, for example, at a glance, I can see Melbourne's in for some rainy weather, but before a week is out. I can also take a closer look, a micro look, and see today is partly cloudy, and it looks like all through the day it's going to be fine enough for me to go for a bike ride. And with the interactivity of this particular visualization, I can dive in even deeper into the detail and see during the day, if I'm heading out at 10 a.m, how warm do I want to be? I think it'll be a puffer jacket kind of ride. This iconic representation, sun, clouds, rain, they're dense representations of the forecast, of the information. The power of micro and macro designs holds for every type of data display, organising complexity through multiple and hierarchical layers of contextual reading. But back to numbers. You might be, I think most of us seem to be familiar with the COVID-19 dashboard from Johns Hopkins. And we can see that visually it's showing us these bubbles, the size of the bubbles, reflect the number of cases, COVID-19 cases. But sometimes numbers can be misleading. So this really precise number, 573,042 global deaths, gives us an impression of certainty that isn't necessarily there in the data. If we look a little closer at the New York data, this is Georgia Lupi from Pentagram has redesigned the data visualizations from the New York governor's presentations. And you can see in this visualization, we have the number 540 lives lost yesterday, but the representation of each life as a hand-drawn dot gives us a sense of scale in a way that a number doesn't always. And I think one of the things I love about this one is the way with highlighting that one dot represents one life lost, it's giving a sense of meaning to the numbers. You know, this is one life lost. And if we take it a bit further and look at the testing rates, she's used a gradient to represent the uncertainty in the numbers. And so you can see on a macro reading, I can see a trend. The proportion of tests for the population of New York is rising over time. And I can do a micro reading and see that there were 670,000 tests with 250,000 positive cases out of a New York population of 9.5 million. There's no question programmers are awesome. And here's a Ryan Gosling meme. But you don't have to code. The tools of digital humanities are endless. This short video is created using the online analysis tool Voyant and my MacBook's QuickTime software. I pasted the transcript of a project chat into Voyant, a couple of terms, so I've updated the stop list, and the word cloud is regenerated. The discussion transcript can also be visualized as a bubble chart. And Voyant's actually created this data visualization with the link that I can go back to at any time. In this case, I've taken the word cloud to generate the Voyant link and forwarded this link to my collaborators for our discussion. Back to the long and short forms, MGSE's International Centre for Classroom Research are publishing a book of terms that maths teachers use about their professional practice. Carmel and I created these animated GIFs, these short looping animations of some of the terms. And these snippets from the research data were able to be shared over social media, embedded into a PowerPoint presentation. This short form of the research data is acting as an invitation to look a little closer at the research in its entirety. We also worked on visualizing the lexicon as a whole. So this interactive visualization lets you, on a macro reading, see that there are a number of terms, 61 terms. And you can dive into each term and see the detail of the definition and the example and categorization. With this visualization, you can see the terms and their categories are signified by the colors. And so with interactivity, you can get a sense of how many terms are in a given category. And again, you can interact with it and take a closer look at a single term. Ada Lovelace wrote about the deeper exploration of a subject that is a product of solving a problem with a computational approach. If you're doing research, think about partnering with someone like Skip as a co-research undertaking to explore your research data. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the chance to talk to you a little about digital humanities.
Okay. So let's get back to this PowerPoint. So what we've seen then is a whole range of different ways in which tools and technology can help.
Sorry, Nick, we're still on the YouTube video.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
I just need to stop sharing and then reshare again.
Okay. Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
So the kinds of things that humanities scholars should know, and we've seen a few of them in the presentations over the last little while, are things like how to convert data into different formats. If you're scraping data from websites, from social media, you need to be able to convert it. So there are ways of converting data. And how to build a collection of research materials. So how to cite your data, where to archive it, how to manage it, so data management, data repositories. These are all things that you need to consider and that things that we can help you with. One of the really important issues that a lot of people struggle with is the difference between presentation of primary records and the long-term access to them. So people often want to create a website without really considering what the data is that they need to create that website. So creating a website on its own can often lead to dead data because you're putting it into a website and then after a while nobody maintains it and the primary data is lost. So we have to think about how to look after primary data and how to make websites and other presentations run from the primary data. One of the things that you've heard about a little bit also is getting data in and out of software. Greg talked about the problem of dead ends and the problem of proprietary formats. So using proprietary tools, even Microsoft Word, can be dangerous if you leave your data in that format and then 10 years later you want to try and get it out, but you find it's sort of locked up. And we've seen a few examples of creating visualizations of complex and large data sets. We're not alone in this. Data management is a big area for many people around the world. There's an excellent reference, which is freely downloadable at that URL, which we can make available if you want to get in touch. I'd really recommend this for anybody that wants some good bedtime reading. The thing about all of this is that the scale of the material that we typically want to address really requires us to deal with it. As Amanda said, sort of talking about distant reading, we need to be able to operate over a lot of material and know what kinds of tools can help us. So if we're working with media, what are some good transcription tools for media? How do we scan manuscripts if we go to an archive? Can we do character recognition, OCR, converting that to text so that we can search it and then we can do analysis on it? And we need to know how all of these different tools can work together and how we can move our data between them. These are all the kinds of things that we can help you with at Skip. We already provide repositories for publications via Minerva, but we also need to think about the primary data that we create. So in my field in linguistics, we're doing fieldwork, recording people speaking and then transcribing that. So all of that material needs to be archived somewhere so that we can reuse it, so that the people we work with can access it, so that our postdocs and PhDs in the future can work on it as well and build on what we've created in the first place, so that we can verify claims that we make, good scientific method, even in the humanities. And the data itself has an inherent value to a general public. In the humanities, a lot of what we do is interesting to the general public in a way that a lot of science data may not be so interesting to the general public. So a lot of what humanities scholars do is digitizing material. So we have to describe it, think about metadata for it, think about the formats, so high resolution formats for the data that we create. I think the rest has been said already. Just give you a quick example of one project that I've run working with manuscript papers. These are manuscripts of Australian Aboriginal languages from the early 1900s. Many manuscript pages, but because they're on paper, it's very difficult to deal with them. It's very difficult to search them. And it's difficult for people who aren't in a capital city at a library to get access to this material. The collection, the part of the collection I worked with had 24,700 pages. A lot of this was handwritten manuscripts, questionnaires sent out to people to fill in with local language terms, and then typescripts. And they look like this. So a sort of fairly typical collection of manuscripts, but lots of them, really lots of them, an enormous amount. And they had to be treated in some way, and I used the text encoding initiative, which is a technology that took a bit of learning, but it allowed me then to put up the images of the manuscripts, as you can see on the right, and the textual version that you can search on the left. And they're all linked up together so that as you scroll through one, you see the others. And of course, once you've got it as textual material, you can search it. So this becomes a really useful research base, but it's also really interesting for the people whose languages are represented. So because the material has geography attached to it, you can map it. So then you can map items in the collection. So here's the word for eye that's in the questionnaire, and you can see that word for eye spread over a map. And this is all linked up because we're using good methodology, and we're not just putting up Microsoft Word documents, but we've got structured textual documents that allow these things to work together in this really interesting way. So this is a sort of typical digital humanities project. To do this, I needed text processors. I need to use an XML editor. I needed to learn some text encoding initiative XML. It's a bit of a steep learning curve. We have it in a Git repository. Again, this is something that needed to be learned, but it's a really great environment for doing this kind of work. And I employed a specialist programmer who created the pipeline to create the website out of the data. So all of these are data management projects, everything we've heard about today. And if we use the right methods and tools, then our research data can be the basis for our own future work. We won't lose our own work and that of other scholars. This is a list of some of the various websites that we think are helpful. We'll make this available to you later, but you might in particular want to look at the SCIP website and our blog on which we're putting up training materials now every month. So you'll be able to find new training in various aspects of digital tools and methods. So I think at this point, I'll